Hi there, Lindsay here, the Frugal Crafter. Today we are going to talk about gouache, and we're going to talk about the differences between professional gouache and student grade gouache. We're going to talk about different ways to use gouache to get different effects, and you can watch me design and paint my World Watercolor Month painting for the prompt Risky. And, well, what's more risky than running a red light, right? And there's a term that I saw in an article once called Amber Gambler. And every time I'm in the car with somebody running a yellow light, I said, "Oh, you're being an Amber Gambler." And the reason I found out about this term was because I had gone through a yellow light, but it turned red when I was in the intersection. And I was worried that there were video cameras on the lights in Maine, and so I had to Google it to see if I was going to get a fine in the mail for running a red light. And apparently in the state of Maine, no. But the article started off with, "So you're an Amber Gambler," and that just stuck in my head. And so I say that every time I go through a yellow light or I'm in a car and somebody else is going through a yellow light. So that's where that term comes from, if you're wondering why it's in this painting. So risky, yes, running a yellow light is risky, and I decided to use that for my prompt. And also I thought it'd be really fun to draw and paint a street light. And so I found this reference photo on Unsplash. You can see I've pulled it up on my phone there. And what I do when I'm using my phone is a reference photo. And by the way, you can download the Unsplash app for free, and then you can access all of those commercial use photos in there, right in your app on your phone. It's very handy, and it will sync toward across your if you use your computer, usually you can sync between different devices, which is very handy because sometimes I'll have an idea for a painting and I'll need a bunch of reference photos for it, and I'll make a folder and I'll put all these different ideas in there, and then when I'm ready to paint, I might be sitting on my deck, I might be sitting on the couch, I might be somewhere else when I want to draw and paint. I can just pull that folder up and I can find it all. So highly recommend that. So I started off with just a regular pencil sketch, and now I'm doing my first technique I like to do with gouache, which is use it like watercolor. Now the paints I'm using here are Daniel Smith gouache, and I only have 5 colors of it because it's expensive stuff. And the good thing about a more professional grade gouache, well, there's a couple of good things. One is that you can find out pigment information and light fast information. So if you want to hang your work or sell your work and it's going to be displayed in light, you don't have to worry about the fading like you might with student grade gouache. Gouache was actually never meant to be a light fast fine art medium. It was always meant for commercial art because it photographs so beautifully and it copies so beautifully because of its matte finish. So up until more recently, even professional grade gouaches weren't necessarily light fast. They didn't need to be. But now you can get light fast gouache, which is really handy if you love the medium and you want to work in that and, hang your work on the wall. So I went ahead and bought the Daniel Smith set of 4 mixing colors, and that included Hansa Yellow Medium, which is kind of a neutral yellow, Pyrrole Red, which is a neutral to fierce, kind of warm leading red, and Ultramarine Blue, which is a neutral to warm leading blue. So this will give me a quite a lovely range. It's not going to give me the brightest green, but it does give me a decent green. It gives me a gorgeous orange. It gives me a very dull purple, but for the most part, I feel like I can get pretty natural mixes with that, which is nice because when you're looking at these Daniel Smith gouache, I was just in an art supply store, and they were $15 and up for a 15 ml tube. And on Blick, you can find them for about $11 and up for a 15 ml tube. So I also bought a tube of burnt umber. Yes, I can mix a brown with those colors in the set, but it's kind of a acidic looking brown. It's not a really rich brown, and it's just a lot easier. And I'll save a lot of my other more expensive pigments by buying a tube of burnt umber. So that's what I did there. So I am using all 5 of these colors. They are all doing the heavy lifting. And now in this layer here, I am building up a more opaque layer. I am adding water to it, but not as much as I did in the background. In the background, I wet my background and I used the paint very watery, so I got that watercolor look. Now I do notice a bit of a larger wet to dry shift when I use gouache as watercolor because it will look a lot more vibrant often when it's wet and then dry more lighter than say a watercolor would. And there wasn't as much drying shift with this as the Mission titanium gouache that I used the other day, but there definitely was still a bit of a shift. So just kind of account for that when you're watering down your gouache, because it is meant to be used a little bit more in mass tone. So you may be wondering, why would you buy that mixing set for $40 when for $40 you can get that set of 56 colors that I recommend for my 30 Days to Better painting class? I think well, for me, it was curiosity. I'm very happy with that Anagani set of gouache I recommended, because each of the little cups of gouache is 30 mLs of paint versus each tube being 15 mLs of paint, and you get 56 of them versus, 4 for the same price. So I'm very happy with that. But what the big difference is between the student grade or the budget, like the jelly gouache there that I recommended, and this would be the pigments used. Now, I don't have the information on the pigments used on the Anagani gouache. As far as I know, that information is not out there. So they could be using food grade or cosmetic grade pigments in those gouaches for some of the colors rather than the more expensive artist grade pigments, which means they could fade. They probably will fade if I hang them in direct light. And also, that also a lot of times they'll use with the student grade products, because in other countries, gouache is used a lot more often. And so they'll be using non-toxic pigments, which means they're using like food grade dyes, and it gets the job done. And then they don't have to worry about toxicity in like children's art materials, but it does definitely compromise on the light fastness issue. If you're working in a sketchbook, it doesn't really matter because it's not going to be getting exposed to light. But if you are, like I said, going to display it, then it's something you want to be concerned with. Also, the pigment load is not going to be quite as strong, meaning, if you wanted to thin it down to a watercolor-like consistency, you might not be able to get that sheerness without it getting really chalky looking. Also, it might just take more paint, like you'd have to put more paint out on your palette to get the job done. Now, I put my paint right in half pans, and I put the white in a full pan and the other colors in half pans in my Portable Painter Micro here. And the reason I did this is because I only have 5 colors, so I knew this was going to be adequate. And I figured I would have just enough mixing space, which I did. I will probably bring out a little dish or something to mix, because that was really pushing it to have such small mixing areas. But I liked that I could just kind of pick it up and move it around, and it was very convenient for this use. I have one of those palettes with a rubber gasket or the silicone gasket for gouache, but I honestly did not like it for that use. This is working better for me, especially with a limited color palette. But I don't know. I'm going to give that a try again for something, because it isn't such a nifty little palette, but it just didn't work for me with gouache anyway. I think this would work pretty well, though, because I could also let it dry out and bring water brushes. I did that with another palette, the Jerry Q Swivel palette, and I really like that because I have half watercolor and half gouache, and it's just the cheaper gouache, so I will use like watercolor for those first layers and then layer up with gouache, which I like that too, but you can do it with one product if you want. Now, the key, if you want to use the watercolor, like the gouache like watercolor, is to get those more saturated, vibrant colors and to stay away from those really kind of pre-made pastel tones. Plus, it would get very expensive if you were buying the pre-mixed colors in the Daniel Smith and getting a large arrangement like that, I think. Although I do have a friend that's going to be sharing her Daniel Smith gouache in some half pans for me, so I can try those out too before I do my full review. But so far, so good. I'm really impressed with this paint. But I have to say, I'm also a really big fan of the student grade Anagani jelly gouache. I feel like with gouache, that is the one medium where you can actually get a really good product in a student grade price. I find that gouache, you don't really notice a quality difference between the price points like you do with watercolor or acrylics, and even oils to an extent. Gouache seems to be pretty adequate even at a student grade level. So I definitely think you can save your pennies and go with the cheaper route. But I had a lot of fun painting with this. I've used the Daniel Smith gouache for a couple paintings so far, and I've been pretty impressed with it. So, I mean, people say that I have an axe to grind against Daniel Smith. I don't. I just, I feel like I'm pretty, I don't want to say brutal, but I don't suffer fools in the art supply product genre. If a company does something sketchy, I call them out on it. It doesn't matter what the company is. It doesn't matter if it's my favorite company or not. I have no skin in the game, I guess. I will say what I think, and but I have nothing against this company. I think they do make good quality products. My only issue with them is the marketing, honestly. I think the products are good. But anyway, I wanted to make that yellow light appear to be glowing, so I've got a lot more white in that mix, and I'm trying to make it a little bit brighter. And I think it worked out pretty well. I wanted to get more of a teal green for that bottom green, but it wasn't happening. I really should add a phthalo blue to my mix, I think, and probably like a quinacridone pink or quinacridone rose. I think then I'd have a really good mixing ability here. One tip I want to mention before we finish up is the fat over lean rule, which means you start with your watery layers first and you add thicker layers as you build up. You do it in oil paints, except you use oil, not water, but it's also really useful when you're doing gouache, so you don't lift up any of those previous layers and you can build and kind of sculpt with your paint as you go. You never want to have really thick, ridgy layers of gouache because that could flake off and crumble because there's not as much binder as you have in watercolor or acrylics or oils. And there you can see the finished product. I did use a letter stencil to trace the words Amber Gambler, and then I just painted it with a very narrow brush, and I forgot to film that part because I was kind of afraid I was going to ruin it, I guess. But anyways, that's how it turned out. I hope you enjoyed this and you got some tips for using your gouache. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below, and I will have a review on this gouache paint coming up in the future, not too long in the near future, here on the Frugal Crafter YouTube channel. I want to thank you so much for watching. Please give me a thumbs up before you go. Until next time, happy crafting.